take us back to July 1944. It's the 75th anniversary now of Bretton Woods. Where was Alan Greenspan in July of 1944?
I was at the Mount Washington Hotel in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. I didn't have a clue what all of that noise around me was. And somebody said, well, there's a big convention here. And I said, oh, too bad. I didn't think about it again for 75 years.
And what were you doing there? You were not part of the delegation negotiating monetary policy.
I was a musician. I was with a small dance band serving as entertainment for the people who went to the hotel. And so I hadn't a clue what I was missing on the floor below. And it was historic news.
It was historic, and it came out of a particular time when you had the Allies, still a year away from the war being over, but thought they were on their way, getting together, and there was a general consensus we needed to cooperate internationally going forward in the way we handled monetary policy. What is left of that? I mean, you had cooperation certainly when you were running the Fed, but now, since the great financial crisis, it's harder to find that sort of coalition building.
Well, one of the things about the IMF and the World Bank Group and the individuals who were representative to the organizations is that we would meet periodically and discuss world affairs. And we'd also meet in other vendors. You know, I spent a good deal of time in Switzerland, for example. And same group of people. And some of them are still around, like Jean-Claude Trichet, the president of Banque de France. And it was the most interesting experience in my life. I mean, I remember going into Basel. We had meetings, dinner meetings, on Sunday night, which those wonderful chefs. And it was the elite of the international financial community. The head of the Bundesbank, the head of the Banque de France, Bank Italia, and there was about 12 of us. And we often met in different places. And I learned more from them interacting, especially, than I did by any other means of communication.
Is it possible to replicate anything like that today? Because as you described that, those were all Western powers. And many of them had shared a commitment to fighting, frankly, Germany and Japan back in those days. Now we have China, clearly a rising economic power. Is it possible to still have the same sort of cooperation, maybe in a different guise?
Well, the irony is China. I got to know the premier and the president of China in the 1990s. And a little bit of the century half. See, what they did 10 years of change in political. And I would say from 1893 to maybe 2001 or something, I was very close to the Chinese hierarchy. One of the fascinating shocks I had is Jiang Zemin was president, and I was having a conversation with him, and he's saying, my favorite composer is an American Schubert. And I'm saying, Schubert? I mean, I would think of Chinese and doing all sorts of peculiar instruments. And not only that, but Zhu Rongji, who was premier, and I got to know each other very well. And he told me, he says, we are trying to replicate the United States. You're manufacturing the way you do it, and we're not quite there yet. You know, I would say, well, why don't you try this, that? He says, we'd like to, but we're not up to it yet. I mean, it was an extraordinary different change. after they all came out of Deng Xiaoping several decades earlier. It was 10 years they kept moving towards the idealism. They became more idealistic in our context. And as a result, I kept saying to myself, they're going to become the United States because of the population and the like. In any event, something happened in the Politburo in, I would say, maybe 1998 or somewhere of that nature, because starting in the next generation, the ever increasing more towards a freer society in China stopped cold. And then 20 years after that, we had President Xi, who could not find somebody to replace him, so he'd just have to stay. And I knew something had happened, but even though, as I said, I was very close friends with, say, Xi Rongji, who was part of the Politburo, he never once indicated what went on within that group. And I, for example, I would say that we were sufficiently close that when I left the Federal Reserve and basically left contact, this would be the last time I'd see these people, they took me in, he and his family took me to dinner at their, I don't know what they call them, where all of the senior members of the government live. And I think it was extraordinary. I mean, it's like letting everybody see your crown jewels. And I still, Xi Rongji wrote a book, which I couldn't read, obviously, but it eventually got published by the Brookings Institution.
But as you say, that impetus to become more like the United States at some point took a different direction. If you look at President Xi now, if anything, there's more state control. We certainly have a huge balance of trade deficit that doesn't seem to be reforming itself. Is there any alternative to really confrontation, economic confrontation with China? Because that's what we're seeing to some extent with the Trump administration and President Xi right now over the trade dispute.
Well, back then, there was none. I don't know if we discussed it explicitly, but tariffs are a tax, and they are a tax not on your opponent, but on your own people. They pay the tax. And the question has always been, taxes are deflationary. And so it was never true that somebody won a trade war. To be sure, there was a winner and a loser, but from a point of view of how much economic activity got changed, they both lost. It's the one who lost the least was declared the winner.
So we have tariffs now. The United States imposed tariffs on China.
Well,
China has imposed retaliatory tariffs.
Of course.
Are we seeing that in the economies of the United States and China in slowing them down?
Well, you can see it in certain of the industries. We don't have enough overall data on China to make much of a judgment, but it has to be. I mean, it's the questions, you put taxes on something, there's less of it. And so there's certain statistics you don't need to calculate. You can just, you know by the nature of the product. And I find that China is drifting off. You know, we basically, we had Mao originally, and then Deng Xiaoping came in. It was a major change. And every president thereafter was more liberal, without the qualification. And when we got to Xi Rongji, he said, "I wish we were the United States." I mean, that was an extraordinary comment for a Chinese to tell an American. It's not that way anymore. And as soon as I saw that President Xi was having difficulty finding a replacement, I said, yeah.
So let's talk about monetary policy, something you know terribly well. We're at a time, I think it's fair to say, of very low interest rates, and they seem to be going south. We have almost $13 trillion in negative yielding debt right now. At the same time, we're having some growth challenges. Are lower interest rates a way to address lack of growth?
The most important question is, how in the world did we end up with negative interest rates? I mean, I've been an economist since I left the music business. Interest rates are a major component of what economists call time preference. It's the extent of discounting human beings make about values today versus values tomorrow. I mean, for example, when Apple had those extraordinarily expensive machines, whatever you want to call them, the people would go around the block to get in the list. The ideal measure of time preference is, what would you pay somebody who is number 5 on the list for the 55th? How much? What would you pay? That is time preference. Now, to have a negative time preference makes no sense. So I don't know what the answer is, but I will say this, that it is the only thing that has come along in generations which I find inexplicable. I know how it works, and I know why it works, and I know why certain, I mean, to hold bonds of say, Switzerland or Germany or something, they will yield X percentage points above Spain, Italy. But I'd never contemplated that you'd ever get negative, because that's what it is. You would be trading something in which you're losing in the process. It can't exist, because you know, interest rates in the United States now and in China are not all that much different from where they were several hundred years ago. Human nature has not changed. Time preference has not changed. And you know, we have the data. And then we run into this particular phenomenon in recent years.
But is it a strange sort of technical aspect of the bond market, or does it tell us something more basic about expectations for the future on people's part?
Well, this is exactly the issue which I spent more time on. Every time I get somebody whom I know is very knowledgeable, I ask them that question. What I find astounding is how few people care about it. And it's not good, but it's not evidently destroying anything as yet. But certainly interest rates have got to have a critical fact, because they always do. It's a key part of the measure of what the valuation of property is. So I know less now about the economy than I did 50 years ago.
Speaking of interest rates, right now there's talk about a possible so-called insurance cut in rates. In 1998, as I understand it, you cut 3 times when we had the Asian crisis developing. Does it make sense to make an insurance cut? Because after that you came back and raised rates. But is that a sensible thing for the Fed to be thinking about as an insurance rate cut?
Yes. It's forecasting is very tricky. Certain forecast outcomes have far more negative effects than others. So in that sense, you will act to reduce the risk of those types of events, and that's a valuable thing to do. I mean, I remember very distinctly on a number of occasions we cut rates not because we thought that it was highly probable that it would be necessary, but the probability, but what would happen if indeed it did happen was very large relative to what other events were. So it's a relative balance. And if you consider that there are certain small probability events which could be very dangerous, it pays to act to see if you could fend it off.
One of the things that's being talked about now is the need perhaps to cut rates, both because of trade uncertainty. Chair Powell talked about that in his testimony quite specifically, as well as anemic or slowing global growth. Not even so much in the United States, but globally. Do lower rates help form a remedy for trade uncertainty and or slowing growth?
It's not something I recall being active in that type of activity. But they might and they might not. I don't think that in and of itself is a reason to act. But there is relative trade-offs to this day.
When we talk about growth, fiscal stimulus is another alternative to monetary stimulus.
Where we come up with these terms, I don't know.
Well, whatever we call it, we just have had a new deal made, bipartisan deal here in Washington, to raise the debt ceiling, to raise the spending caps, to spend more money. A lot of it in defense, some of it in domestic. That is a form of fiscal stimulus. Is that likely to lead to greater growth?
The one you're talking about, no. One of the reasons, remember, is that when you increase the deficit, if it is prolonged, it'll end up as inflation. You know, when over the decades, when people became very irresponsible, what would happen? You'd get inflation, which meant, you know, in a sense, people would be discarding money in a manner which affects prices. And more and more I hear about what's going on at the moment, there's an awful lot going on.
So why aren't we seeing inflation? I mean, the Fed actually has a target of 2%. They can't get up to the target of 2% with really pretty low interest rates. We've got a lot of fiscal stimulus, a lot of borrowing. So why aren't we getting to inflation?
It's the same issue as negative rates. If you go from negative to positive or semi-positive to more positive, the relationship is the same, but the whole structure is down, and we have not yet really answered the question as to what has happened. Human nature has not changed. The rates of discount of future values haven't changed that significantly. Something is going on. Now, I've asked that a question to a large number of very prominent economists whose views I expect. My knowledge is enhanced to zero.
We hear talk about two possible phenomena that could change the paradigm, really change it for the first time since Bretton Woods 75 years ago. One is globalization, and another is technology. The advent of the digital world has just changed the way we generate goods, services, value.
Not really. Fundamentally, the value preferences are human preferences, and it's got very little to do with, or it should have, the technological structure. And indeed, that's one of the aspects of why I find negative interest rates so peculiar, because human nature has not changed at the point where we're talking very low rates. At these rates, the probability, based on past history, of them going higher rather than lower is very high. But I've been saying that for months. I've bitten my tongue so often on this issue that it needs resuscitation.
People have been talking about the danger of the debt, deficit, but also debt, overall debt of the United States for some time, predicting the bond market would correct the situation. We haven't seen it. Why is that? Are you still concerned about the overall debt of the United States?
Well, just remember that one of the reasons why you're worried about debt is that ultimately it leads to a monetization of the debt, which in turn means the money supply is accelerating faster than the economy, which invariably means inflation. And we've had no inflation. The no inflation is related to the issue of interest rates in this regard. I literally feel as though my level of knowledge is sunk in some way. The only thing that saves me sort of competitively is I don't know anybody who's done any better.
Well, let's talk about something else that you may know about, cryptocurrency. I mean, it's really been talked about a lot, and particularly most recently with Facebook, talking about this Libra, that they could potentially expand to 2+ billion people through Facebook. There have been these hearings up on the Hill, and part of it, we actually have heard, again, from Chair Powell from the Fed, says he's concerned about what it could do to stabilization of the economy and the money supply, because maybe they'd be outside of the control of the Fed.
Well, a number of cryptocurrencies are basically have value, as all bonds without any backing have. The reason essentially is if somebody, well, let's take a very specific example. When this country began, we could not afford the armaments that George Washington needed. So what did we do? We printed money. Now the point here is that the true value of that is zero, but they were nonetheless accepted at par for a couple of years after the printing. I mean, the sort of the Continentals, which is what they call them, actually had value, or put it more exactly, that they weren't discounted at 100%. And so you raise the question, well, can you basically get a negative effect in the sense that there's now back in late 1800s? And the answer is you can't. In other words, and it's as the actual interest rates that were sort of gained during the early parts of the Revolutionary War, people continued to be able to buy things with them because they went from zero discount to 20% to 30% to 95%. Well, somebody was willing to accept that other than what its intrinsic value should have been.
And if people are willing to accept, for example, Libra, if it ever exists, the Facebook cryptocurrency, could it take away the power of the Fed, of the ECB, of the Bank of Japan to control the money supply, because it really is outside of the normal money supply?
It's a question of whether it is considered money in any meaningful sense. There are many variations of money, but if people are willing to accept at some discount rate, but nonetheless willing to accept it, it has value. I mean, it wasn't until Continentals got down to 2% out of 100 that people became acutely aware it's not worth a Continental. Well, that meant that you had to have people who purchased it at a discount rate of 3% and sold it at 2% or something like that. And we have all those peculiarities which don't make any sense. The Continentals should never have had any value at any time, but they did, and ever since, we experienced very much the same process.
You've had experience at the top level of Washington and power and government for longer than just about anybody I know, goodness knows. We've talked a lot about entitlements through the years and the danger of entitlements, something I know you're concerned about, the extent to which the building up of the entitlements really is taking away from savings and productivity. Do you see any prospect, any catalyst that would cause the country actually to turn around on the subject and actually address it in a serious way?
None that I've seen. The reason is that it's a very difficult political issue. People who want to get out and say, cut entitlements, might as well turn in their congressman card. It just doesn't happen. And it's only when the system breaks down that you get a significant response. But remember that if I'm printing money and I'm giving it out and getting things for it, if you get, I mean, unless the cost of printing is very large, it's the paper that's really the only thing of value, and it never goes negative. I should say we haven't had negative interest rates, but now that's gone at this stage. But there are very interesting peculiarities in the financial markets, which everyone takes as a given, but why is it taken as a given?
When you were chairman of the Fed, communication was a very important part of what you did. It still is today, the guidance that we get out of the Fed, what they say. Explain how it worked when you were chairman of the Fed, because we had an incident I know you know about last week where we had the vice chair speaking out and the president of the New York Fed speaking out, and it was taken by the marketplaces indicating it's going to be 50 basis points, about 25%, and then the New York Fed had to pull it back. We didn't see that in the Greenspan era. How did you run it? How did you make sure that your various regional governors as well as your FOMC just weren't sending out messages that were contradictory with one another or with what you wanted?
Well, just remember that you go back to Volcker's era, and nobody knew what the Federal Reserve was doing. The only information that the Fed published was their weekly balance sheet and the discount rate, and they just kept quiet. They never, they didn't say we're tilted this way or tilted that way, and nonetheless, people came to conclusions, and Fed watchers, so to speak, were highly paid people in Wall Street. Now, the problem now is that I think we are, and I've told my friends at the Fed, it's one thing to make forecasts, it's another thing to promise anything, unless you are sure. And assuredness is regrettably not as widespread as we'd like it to be.
Is there any prospect we could go back, if not all the way, part of the way toward what you referred to when Paul Volcker was head of the Fed? That is to say, less communication. Why do we have all of these speeches being given all the time? Every week we have 5, 6, 7 different Fed speakers who are speaking out. Why do we need that? Why is that beneficial?
No reason that I can think of. The one thing that has been a very considerable surprise in recent years is the extent to which unequivocally entitlements are crowding out gross domestic savings dollar for dollar. And gross domestic savings coupled with the savings borrowed from abroad is what finances capital investment. Capital investment is the key to productivity gains. It may account for, it depends where, maybe 70, 80%. And productivity is the most crucial statistic in evaluating the state of a market economy. And right now, our productivity growth rate is slow, and it's being caused largely by the entitlement program. Now, to get that changed is a huge political issue. By starting with, well, which entitlements would you choose to change? And so it's become a political issue.
Is the problem with capital investment in the United States today, is it a supply problem or a demand problem? In this sense, is it that there's not enough capital to be invested, or is it there isn't the appetite on the part of CEOs to invest the capital? Because we do have low interest rates, and we had the tax accommodation that would actually allow you to expense your capital investment, and it went up for a while, and then it came back down again.
Well, first of all, you have to remember where capital investment comes from. It's initiated in the executive committee of a corporation, and it's caused by some individual in the organization saying if we were to build a new plant here, its rate of return would be 20% or something like that. They then vote, and that's what we call a capital appropriation. That's the point at which it was made. Then 6 months later, the spending figures are made there because they don't spend everything right away. And that process is going on today. And we're getting capital goods a little weak, but not a great deal weak. And they essentially have been coming down in a manner which I don't consider to be particularly dangerous. And indeed, the data we work with actually shows a slight uptick in the last couple of months. So that that's not where the problem is. The problem is in the valuation. And I should say that it's not in the valuation. It's in the fact of what interest rates do. I mean, I'm thinking of going back to music. I mean, a G note is a G note as it was back in Beethoven.
The saxophone could use you, yeah.
Right. But I'm really puzzled. Now, ultimately, it will emerge. But how you get human nature as we've known it, remember, interest rates in ancient Greece were not typically different from where they are today. Now, that tells you that we're dealing with a human nature stability. And I've had no problem with that. I understand what that means fully. I've never understood the most recent phenomenon with negative interest rates being the first designation of it, but it's continued on. Something has got to give, and I don't know when it's going to happen. That it will happen I'm sure. You keep running these big budget deficits, and interest rates will go up. I've been saying that for months because I believe it. But do I have the evidence? No.
Yeah, and the question is when.
On the issue of when, I have yet no evidence.